like to give an analysis of Romans 13, 1-7. Of all the passages in the Bible, it's this one that I think causes more confusion, even in the most hardcore believers. The passage is believed to say, no matter what, we are to be absolutely submissive and in agreement with government powers, no matter what, no matter where, no matter when. And they're all established by God, and they're all good. And clearly, what about the Nazis? I mean, everybody knows the counter-arguments to that. This doesn't make sense. People are confused by this. In my old job, when I was a chaplain at the Kalamazoo County Jail, the chaplain over me, he was a staunch believer. He said, I believe the whole Bible is inerrant except Romans 13, 1-7. So we have to find some explanation of this. We live in a time where governments are responsible for abortion, all kinds of evil everywhere. We live in a world of evil. John 7:7. The works of the world are evil. What we need to do is go through the older translations, the Young Literal Translation, the King James, Geneva, the Darby, Wycliffe, and then look at the newer translations, NIV, NLT, NASB, and so forth. And we're going to see the older translations say one thing, and the newer translations say something a little bit different, and that's where all the confusion comes in. So let's first analyze the King James, and this will start us understanding what the problem is here, and where all the confusion is. Because people are right to question this if they think that the Bible's saying let's be obedient to governments that are responsible for abortion, for example. They're in support of that, just to give one example. Obviously, that doesn't make sense because it's very clear in the Bible abortion is a sin. Okay, so let's go through it here. Starting off at Romans 13:1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. Now, higher power, that typically means, to my understanding, something of the heavens, spiritual power. People often refer to God as the higher power. So if you go look at the NIV or something, they'll say to the governing authorities. Very different. Okay, higher power sure sounds like something more like God than it does something like George W. Bush, for example. Okay? See, we're starting to get to the divide here of why the new translations and the old translations sound so different. So we can see there's something going on here where these translators, which are the experts in their fields, past and present, but there's something going on here where the older translations translate higher power, whereas the new translations translate governing authorities, kind of a more that theme, which sounds very different. One sounds like our government, the other sounds like God. So the Greek word there for authority is exousia. To my knowledge, there's a lot that can be said about the translation of that word, but it in general means power and authority. But look at the next sentence in the King James. For there is no power but of God. God is the creator of all things, Revelation 4:11, Colossians 1:16, 17, etc. Verses all over the place. So he is in control. He is the power. He's the one in control. If there's evil, it's because he allows it. He creates the world that has evil and allows it to exist. That's why it says in Isaiah 45:7, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Sin and evil are different. The Lord creates evil, but not sin. Galatians 2:17 says Jesus is not the author of sin. So anyway, that's in my book, God, Faith. I wrote about that extensively. So the point here is in Revelation 13:1, it's telling us in the King James, in this older translation, that every soul is to be subject to the higher powers, and there's no power but God. So it's saying every soul is subject to God. And then it says in the next part, the powers that be are ordained of God. So what is the context here? Immediately someone thinks, oh, that must mean the powers in the world. are ordained of God, like Hitler or George W. Bush or whoever. Okay, but you got to go with the context of the verse. The verse is not talking about that. The verse is clearly talking about power from above. So when it says, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, it would seem safe to say in the King James here that that's referring to higher power, the up high in the heavens, power coming down from above, not earthly power. And of course that's confirmed by the next part of the verse here. There is no power but of God. So we have to stay in the context. The powers that be are ordained of God. Okay, so that's just saying the same thing in different words, that the powers are the higher powers. What a person typically does is believes that, oh, that must mean earthly powers. But it doesn't say that in Romans 13:1. There is no, the context is to talk about the higher powers, the powers from God. There is no jump to talk about earthly power that's made there. So to stay with what the text says, we must conclude that in Romans 13:1, we're only talking about power from above, not power from earth, the earthly government powers and so forth. So that's in the King James here. Let's go to verse 2. Whosoever therewith resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Again, all the same context, talking about the power from God. No mention here of governing powers, government powers, Hitler, George W. Bush kind of stuff, nothing. Only the higher powers is the context here. So far getting to Romans 13:2, if we think that this is confusing because, we shouldn't be subject to an evil government of the world, well, that's not what's discussed here. Irrelevant. So let's go to verse 3. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Let's stop right there. So we're in the same context, talking about higher powers from above, from the heavens. It says those, in that context, those rulers have to be who we've talked about in the first two verses. The powers ordained of God, from above. Okay, and of course they're a terror to what is evil, not to what is good. Let's continue. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Talking about the fear of the Lord there. Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. So I think you get the point here. This is not about earthly governments. So when somebody says, I don't understand Romans 13:1, I can't obey my government that sponsors abortion and makes it legal, to give an example. So how does the Lord say in Romans 13:1 that he ordained that power? Well, he doesn't. It's not talking about that. This is a great example. It just shows how people in the world today are not reading the Bible. We are in the age of the apostate church, which is predicted in 2 Thessalonians 2, among other places in the Bible. The church falls away from the Word, from Christ, from God in the end times. Let's continue to verse 4. For he is the minister of God to thee. This just must be talking about powers in heaven. And his minister is a flame of fire. To my knowledge, when the word minister shows up in the Bible, whatever went into translating it, and it's pretty unanimous across the translations of when that shows up, it's often referring to angels. And in this context, that's probably who is being referred to here. Look at Hebrews 1:13-14. But to which of the angels said he at any time, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool? And verse 14, are they not all ministering spirits? Notice it's referring to the angels there as ministering spirits. Interestingly, it says all. Starting 14 over, are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be heirs to salvation? And there it is right there. This is about the heavenly hosts, not about Barack Obama, Adolf Hitler, Caligula, all the earthly governments that act in sin. There's no mention of earthly governments, and everything is in the context of higher powers. So the rulers being referred to are not rulers of the flesh. Whoever is, for he is the minister, whoever that he is there. Let's continue on. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Okay, obviously talking about the fire at the end of the world and so forth there. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. And then verse 7, therefore render to all their duties, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Nothing about taxes there, and so forth. So this should be pretty clear. Romans 13 is about the governing authority, which is God and his heavenly hosts. This is not about George W. Bush and Hitler and Barack Obama and supporting abortion and so forth. People have really been in a whirlwind about this, trying to figure it out, but it's right there. Now let's find out why there's some of this confusion. Let's read the NIV, for example. Same passage, up to verse 7. Let's go to 13:1. Let every one be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Look how different that is. I go with the King James way of looking at this. Why do I say that? Because God, we already said, because God is in control. God is the power behind everything. He is the one, he's the creator of all. He's in complete control. So he has to be the one where all power comes from. So you say, why are evil governments allowed to exist? Because the world is a world of evil. Okay, that's why God will allow them to exist. The world is created imperfect, Jeremiah 18:4. People are created imperfect. So you have the mess we have. Let's go to verse 2 of the NAV. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authorities, rebelling against what God has instituted. No, that's just so different than the King James. That just sounds a little bit like how people talk when they talk about rebelling against the government, of the human government or governments. Look at the King James. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. They're talking about the power of God. It's very clear the context there in the King James. Okay, verse 3 in the NIV. For rulers hold no terror to those who do right, but for those who do wrong. So let's go to verse 4. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. The King James reads, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. The King James is essentially saying it is those in the heavenly domain that will execute wrath on God's behalf. And the NAV is saying it is human people that are evil that God is acting through. As if God is working through sin and evil. God can work through evil, but not through sin. But it's as if the sinner, the evil leader doing abortion and so forth, killing Anne Frank, whatnot, God works through that. That's just not possible. The way the NIV reads, it essentially is sort of a situation like if you're good, good things will happen to you. If you're bad, bad things will happen to you. It's roughly a prosperity gospel. Flavor, not necessarily. Prosperity gospel being the idea that if you're a good boy, you'll get a lot of money. As if that was biblical, as if Jesus was wealthy, which is not, he was homeless. So there is, of course, heavy correlation, especially in the Old Testament, to if you're sinful, if good or bad things happen to you. But the good or bad things are, people usually view that in terms of prosperity, the good or bad things. Well, if I'm good, I'll have no pain and lots of money. And if I'm bad, I'll have pain and no money. That's not the way the Bible describes it, though. If you are one who the Lord acts through and therefore are righteous, you have things like a healthy family, free of disease. Your enemies, the attackers, are kept at bay and so forth. It's a very different message than what we just said. So the NIV reads sort of in a way of saying, if you're bad things will happen to you, which is, I find that a very infantine, immature view of the gospel, one that has very poor grasp of the Old Testament, such as, 1st, 2nd Chronicles and so forth. But whereas the King James strictly keeps that execution of the wrath of God in the higher powers, not earthly governing authorities, human governing. So those are the agents of Satan. Satan has been given the power to be the ruler of this world, this culture, and that's not who God is acting through. God is the creator of all things, the controller of all things. So when a sinful act happens, it has to be a no thing, a nothing. It's a void in reality. It's unrighteousness, lack of righteousness, lack of reality, to put it in a Reformed Calvinistic sense. So if you take the NIV's way of reading, you would have really tough conclusions to come to. For example, Anne Frank is a wrongdoer, just a little girl, and she's killed by the servants of God, who are the Nazis. That simply doesn't work. The King James reading would not involve that conclusion about Anne Frank. Okay? Verse 5 in the NIV. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of the possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. The King James. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. And look at what the NIV does here in verse 6. This is why you pay taxes. The King James says, for this cause pay ye tribute also. Pay tribute. What could pay tribute mean? The King James. Well, let's look it up in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. It means to honor and praise someone. Serious difference between the NIV and the King James. So where we're going in this video is that the older translations have Romans 13:1-7 clearly saying that the governing authorities are God and his powers of heaven, and the godly powers with him, heavenly hosts, etc. Whereas the newer translations don't say that. They say governing authorities. You can really see that here in 3:6, where the King James talks about paying tribute, and the newer translations talk about paying taxes. All the older translations, we'll see in a minute, say pay tribute. So there's this clear rift, this very strict divide between old and new translations, which is very mysterious. And it's most remarkable, perhaps, that it's all the older translations have one theme and all the newer ones that have another. But again, this leads to Romans 13:1-7 being about God in the old translations and about God working through sinful governments in the new ones. Literally opposite ends of the spectrum, one being theologically contradictory, the other being absolutely theologically consistent. Let's look at some of the other translations in 13:6. Let's start with the old ones. The Young Literal Translation, probably my favorite translation of the Bible. For because of this, also pay ye tribute. Okay, the Wycliffe, give tributes. The Geneva, it's like the King James, pay tribute. The Darby, pay tribute. You see a theme here? All the old ones. Now let's go to the new ones. NIV, we already said say pay taxes. Let's look at the ESV. Taxes. Let's look at the NLT. Taxes. Now let's go to the NASB, hugely popular translation. Taxes. So this is a rather amazing theme where all the old say one thing, tributes, and all the new say another. We've already explained that pay tributes, according to the dictionary definition, means praise and honor. On Wikipedia, the first thing I notice here is at the top on the page for tribute, they specify that this is not identical to a tax. This is not to be confused with the Wikipedia entry for tax, telling us at the least there's some distinction that Wikipedia is making between tribute and tax. All right, let's start reading here. Sentence 1, we notice it's a Latin word. Tribute is wealth, often in kind, that a party gives to another as a sign of respect, or, as was often the case in historical contexts, of submission or allegiance. Then the rest of this introduction of Wikipedia expands on that. What I found interesting when I read this is this sounded a little more like a tithe and a little less like a tax. Let's go over to Wikipedia and look at tax. A tax is a compulsory financial charge or some other type of levy imposed upon a taxpayer, an individual or legal entity, by a governmental organization in order to fund government spending and various public expenditures. So there's a stark difference between tribute and tax. And that further outlines our question of how these words are being used interchangeably in the old versus the new translations. This further exacerbates this problem. Now let's go to the dictionary. Look at the definitions here in dictionary.com. A gift, testimonial, compliment, or the like, given as due or an acknowledgement of gratitude or esteem. A stated definition 2, a stated sum or valuable consideration paid by one sovereign state to another in acknowledgement of subjugation or as the price of peace, security, protection, and the like. 3, a rent, tax, or the like, as that paid by a subject to a sovereign. 4, any exacted or enforced payment or contribution. That sounds like taxation right there, definition 4. 5, obligation or liability to make such a payment. So does definition 5. So 2 of the 5 definitions and the last 2 may sound like taxation, but that leaves the problem that the other 3 more prominent definitions don't. Now let's look at tax in dictionary.com to see the contrasts. Definition 1, a sum of money demanded by a government for its support or for specific facilities or services levied upon incomes, properties, sales, etc. Definition 2, a burdensome charge, obligation, duty, or demand. See, it's very different than tribute. And then the definitions 3 through 5 are in the same vein. So what are we seeing here? What's the theme? The theme is that tax is a levy, a forced pay, where tribute is not. Tribute is more of an allegiance and a submission, a teaming up, so to speak. So that's our glaring distinction. Now, what we want to know is how was the word used in ancient Rome at the time of the letter to the Romans. That's the issue. Is it used more like a forced payment or some sort of offering of submission, allegiance, and respect? That will settle this issue. So typically when I hear analysis of Romans 13:1 to 7, I hear people saying, oh, there's a context. Paul was just writing to the small group of Roman Christians. I personally don't agree with that kind of thinking. It's the letter to the Romans, sure. But I hold the view that the Bible was written by God, not Paul writing to a small group of people, but God writing to the whole world. So I think the context of the letter to the Romans is the whole world, everybody, equally, at all times, equally relevant, and equally to all. So I don't hold that view. But anyways, what people typically will say is that, yes, the context is to this small group of Romans. So if the word tax is to be used, then the Greek word should match the definition of taxation in the Roman Empire. So that'll tell us further if the word tax or tributes is more applicable here, the newer or the older translations of Romans 13:1 to 7. Because tribute sounds like some sort of alliance or submission rather than forced financial payment punishable by jail time and so forth, where tribute is sort of an appeasement, a way to make good relations and get security by submitting to authority. Sounds much more like tithing. So let's go to Oxford Handbooks Online. Taxation in the Greco-Roman world, the Roman Principate. So scroll down here to where it talks about in the time of the book of Romans, the letter to the Romans being written. Let's go to this second paragraph. By tributa stipendia are always meant taxes raised on the basis of a census or tax list. So this is calling these taxes here. Next sentence. Because of their exclusive status, this is largely true for all citizens of a state in antiquity, these tributa were not levied on Roman citizens, but only in exceptional circumstances as in war. That is key right there. And why is that key? Because the definition of levy is to impose. It's a burden, as if it's forced. This is specifically not what was going on in the Roman Empire, except as it says here in rare circumstances. But that is exactly what taxation means in our world now. Look at dictionary.com. One of the dictionary definitions we did not read. Number 8, verb, to levy taxes. Okay, look at number 4, to lay burden on, make serious demands on. This is not what tribute means. And tribute being called the tax in the Roman Empire simply is not what it means in the modern world. Therefore, tribute and tax are not interchangeable at all, as they've been translated, as if being interchangeable. In ways they're opposites. One is levied, the other is not. One is a burden, the other is not. When we think of tax in our world, we mean some kind of forced payment, which is specifically not what it meant at the time of Paul's writing his letter. In other words, God writing the book of Romans for the world. So if one wants to say, oh, the context is so important, the context would specifically tell us that what Paul meant, if he's just considered talking to a small group of Romans, is not anything what we mean by tax in today's world. He means just what we read about tribute a few minutes ago in Wikipedia, is a kind of wealth that a party gives to another as a sign of respect, submission, and allegiance. That is more like a tithe. That is more like a giving of one's being, like a surrender, of becoming cooperative with, and so on. So this seals it, that the word tax is not what is to be used in Romans 13:6, and it's also used in 7 in all the new translations, and not in the old ones which use tribute, because the new translations are incorrect. It should be translated with a different word. Tribute's fine, that's a good word, obviously the most accurate, but to put it in more of a modern parlance, probably, well, just like it says in Wikipedia here, something like respect, submission, or allegiance. Or I would add surrender. That would be the correct translation. We can see this more if we just read a little more from this Oxford Handbooks entry. Scroll down a little more, look at this paragraph here. What is crucial is how to translate tributum and vectigal. Vectigal being another type of tax used at a different time in the Roman Empire. Continuing, until the 12th century, tributum was translated by direct tax and vectigal by indirect tax in an attempt at adequate differentiation. And note that this entry then says, but this does not fit modern economic tax theory. And then we can skip down to the last sentence. Therefore, a better translation nowadays would be so-called direct tax for the tributum. So there we can see right there that equating tribute and tax is erroneous. They're different concepts, where the modern translations, NIV and NLT and NASB and so forth, are incorrect. And tribute, or words I just mentioned, should be used instead. Let me go to Wikipedia. Starts off at the top saying a tributum is a tax imposed, there it does say imposed, on the citizenry, but only to fund the cost of war. And let's skip down to here, after it talked more about how the tributum is to cover the costs of war. Wikipedia says, the tributum cannot be fully considered, quote, a tax, unquote, as there was an underlying idea that it could be paid back once military pressure was relieved. Not only is it not forced across all property for supporting government features of any sort, but rather only the government feature of war, but it could be paid back. It's almost like, I was reading some sites that were calling it almost like a debt of the government to the citizenry. So, I mean, we can go on, but I think we're kind of getting to the point. We could get much more technical with more expert analysis of tribute versus tax in the Roman Empire, but I think we're getting the picture here that tax is wrong, and therefore the modern translations are wrong, and the older translations, Darby and King James and so forth, are correct. And this settles the issue. I'm not sure why nobody's seen this before. It's glaringly obvious. It's right here, and when you just study the historical nature of taxation in Rome. And how do we avoid the conclusion that this seals it, that Romans 13 is about authority of God, not authority of governments from God, which ends all the controversy about Romans 13, all the mystery and wonder about it. What becomes more mysterious is how this bad translating can happen unanimously across the newer translations. So let's go to verse 7 though. In the NIV, give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. And, of course, we have the same issue going on in the King James. Render, therefore, to all their dues. Tribute, to whom tribute is due. Custom, to whom custom. Fear, to whom fear. Honor, to whom honor. I think you can see here there is no problem about Romans 13. What is going on? We pay tribute to the higher powers, okay, because all that comes from the Lord. So you look at Hebrews 1:14 here. Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? That serving is governing authority. That's what Romans 13:1 is about. The governing authorities come from the Lord. If you have a guardian angel, for example, which you all do, that's a power given from the Lord, empowered by the Lord, because God is the one power. Now, this is a little bit different than a passage that's often compared to Romans 13:1-7. And that passage is the one you see on your screen here, 1 Peter 2:13-17. If we go through that, we can see it's not quite the same kind of passage as Romans 13:1-7. So starting off here at 1 Peter 2, verse 13, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be the king as supreme. Now, this is what we saw Jesus do. He was unjustly to be crucified, and he allowed himself to be turned in. Peter, for example, resisted and cut off the ear of the soldier, which Jesus immediately healed so he can be turned in. So Jesus is submitting himself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, because the Lord's plan is in effect. Now, the difference between Romans 13 and this passage here in Peter is that Romans 13 seems to say that, we're to pay taxes according to evil governments, and evil governments are sent by God and all this kind of stuff. This is what 2 Peter 2:13-17 doesn't have. Let's go to verse 14. Or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. Okay, now that doesn't say all governors are sent by the Lord and given their capacities for doing righteousness. Second Peter sounds like there are some that are and some that aren't doing the works of the Lord. Obviously, someone like Hitler is not doing the works of the Lord. So let's go to verse 15. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So that seems to be all consistent, and there doesn't seem to be much question there. Again, the differences between Romans 13 and this have already been pointed out and are very clear. So this, I don't think, is a very good comparison to Romans 13. Romans 13, 1 to 7 being about the power of God and the power he's given his heavenly hosts, and 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17 being about that there are at least some governments that God has sent and therefore given power, and he will punish evildoers. It does not indicate all governments, like the Nazis, for example. Even if you had the incorrect new translations of Romans 13, they still wouldn't be a comparison to 1 Peter 2 that we just read. And I've heard some people say that Acts 4 appears to involve rebellion of Peter and John against the government, which would be a contradiction to 2 Peter we just read. But if you look at it carefully, it does not involve any such rebellion. Peter and John were simply arrested, and they were asked of why they were doing what they were doing, and they said, because God is working through us, creating the healings. And it says right in there, Acts 4:8, that Peter was filled with the Holy Spirit. So you can read the passage later on your own, but I just want to tell you that that's a misunderstanding. There's no rebellion. This is, of course, another example of the Christ-like power that is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9. And I heard that idea that Acts 4 involved rebellion from the Zondervan YouTube channel by apparently some prestigious professor or pastor. So never underestimate those who are in high places to misinterpret the word, to give the wrong message, to add to it, to take away, and to tarnish it from what it says.